All right, here we are. By the way, is the sound working?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
checking. Yeah, because you never know with this thing. Sometimes it can be a little iffy. But anyway, here we go. So looks like we're all here. So why don't we start with where we left off last week? So you might recall, sorry, not last week, on Monday, you might recall that we were working on chapter 3. Let me get that open for you. And in chapter 3, we were looking at the production possibilities frontier, which is a graph, if you recall, that shows us how much of 2 different goods we can produce with the same resources. So I picked an example that I thought would make everybody happy, and that, of course, is Starbucks. So the idea here is that if you look at this graph, here it is. Let's look at this one. The idea here is that we have a chart here which shows how much of espresso and latte Starbucks can produce with the same resources. Now, when I say same resources, I mean, of course, the same amount of labor, the same amount of materials, coffee beans, etc., and the same amount of time. So within a given time frame, it's possible for them to make 28 espressos with no lattes, or 30 lattes with no espressos, or some combination of both. Now, it's not obvious by looking at this table, though, that the curve that reflects this, or the graph that reflects this, is actually a big curve. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Noah.
I can't see your screen.
Oh, really? It says that I'm screen
I can't
sharing.
see your face cam either. Can anyone else see it? Is it just me?
Just
Yeah,
rejoin
I
and
can
it
see
works
it.
when I do
Yeah.
that.
I can see the
it.
screen, but not as webcam.
I usually
That's
rejoin
weird.
and it works.
I
If I
can
get that.
Okay, I'm gonna try leaving and coming back.
I'm seeing my own self on the right-hand corner here, and you're seeing the slides, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
You're hearing my voice?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, that's good. And I know the recording is going. I can tell. You can tell. You know what I
Okay, it's
discovered?
working now.
Okay, wonderful. There's this little tiny red dot that gets bigger and smaller, and that means the camera's working. That's good because, it's possible to forget to turn it on. It does occasionally happen. So we don't like that, do we? No, the whole point of all this is that you should be able to watch the recording if you miss something. Anyway, so let's get back to where we were. So this graph, on this graph, I have espressos on the vertical axis and lattes on the horizontal axis. These are the quantities of both goods that I'm producing. And all the points are shown here, points A through G. In the upper left-hand corner, we have only espresso. In the bottom right-hand corner, we have only latte. And then we have all these other options in between. And if you recall, we discussed the idea that all the points right on the curve are points of maximum efficiency. In other words, if you're on this curve, you're producing these products with no waste, okay? In other words, the workers aren't goofing around. You didn't spill the espresso beans on the floor. The machines aren't breaking down. Everything's going fine. And so that being the case, ideally, you want to produce at one of these points. Now, how do you decide that? Well, that's going to ultimately depend on what the customers want. And it also will depend to a certain degree on how much we can charge for each product. Obviously, if we're selling a lot of lattes and they cost more money, we may want to produce more lattes. If the espressos are selling like crazy, we may want to produce more espressos. But the bottom line is any one of these points represents maximum efficiency. And of course, the only way we can maximize our profits is to produce at the highest level of efficiency. Now, of course, that by itself doesn't guarantee that we'll make money, but it certainly increases the likelihood quite considerably because, of course, people still have to come in the door and buy these products. That's not a problem for Starbucks, is it, though? Have you ever met anybody who didn't know what Starbucks was? I bet you haven't. It's one of the most famous companies in the world, and they know how to advertise and promote their product. In fact, the funny thing is they don't really advertise on TV, do they? It's really all word of mouth. How do they do this? What is their secret? Well, the products are of very high quality. It's easy to get in and out in a hurry, and it works. So that's why they're so successful. But even they have to pay very close attention to efficiency. They cannot be wasting resources. Otherwise, they would soon find themselves going out of business, because you know perfectly well their profit margins are tight. If you pay them, let's say, $2 for a cup of coffee, well, let's just say that they're not making a whole lot of profit on each unit that they're selling you. Their profits are really coming by selling you a large volume of products, each of which is only slightly profitable. Okay, so that's the type of business model that they have. A lot of volume is needed because each individual unit that they sell you is not producing a whole lot of profits for them. Now, we also saw these other 2 points on the curve. The one on the interior is considered to be inefficient because it means, for example, look at H. If I'm at H, I could easily move up to B and make a lot more espresso without giving up any lattes. The only way that can be happening is if I'm wasting resources. Same thing over here. I could just as easily, and hearing a lot of feedback. I don't know what's causing it.
It's caused by people not being muted.
No, they're all muted. I'm
I know, I
scrolling.
mean, someone wasn't muted. They probably fixed it now, but that's what was causing it.
I get it. Okay, well, thanks. Because I'm so low tech, I don't really know what's going wrong in these cases. Yes, anytime you have any technological suggestions, you can send them right my way, because I'm the least knowledgeable about technology that you'll ever meet. You can assume I know exactly nothing about the technology, and that will often be the case. So anyway, but as opposed to these points, in order to go from B to C, for example, in order to get more lattes, I have to give up some espressos. Because I'm maximizing my efficiency, it's not possible to have more lattes without sacrificing some espressos. It's kind of like time. Is it possible for you to spend more time watching movies without giving up something else? No, because you only have 24 hours. If you want to have more time with one activity, it has to come at the expense of another activity. That's just the way it works. So here, the same thing is going on at all these points along the curve. The only way I can move down this curve and have more lattes is to give up some espressos. And if I go the other direction, in this direction, I'm giving up lattes to make more espressos. And this is what we expect to see when we're producing at the maximum level of efficiency. So this is how we know that H is not efficient, because that's not true. We can easily get more of one good without giving up some of the other. That implies that we're producing at an inefficient point here. And in fact, that's true of all points inside this curve. It's not just H. So we want to avoid that one. On the other hand, I looks like a wonderful point to be producing at, because look at this. I has more lattes than B, and yet the same number of espressos. If you look down in this direction, you can see that I, compared to E, has more espressos with the same number of lattes. So what this tells me is that I don't have the ability to produce at this point with my given level of resources. We say that this point is not feasible. Anything outside the curve is considered to be not feasible, meaning that I cannot achieve that with the resources that I have. Now, having said that, that can change over time. I think somewhere along the way, we may have discussed this. I don't specifically remember, but let me just show you what that would look like. Over time, let me just see. What would happen is this. All right, so over time, Starbucks can acquire more resources. Whoops, Starbucks can acquire more resources, buy more advanced equipment, increase the training of the employees, all of which will increase productivity. This in turn will increase the output that we can produce with a given amount of resources. So in other words, if this is happening, imagine them coming in and saying, you know, these old espresso and latte machines are wearing out. Maybe we should buy some new ones. What would you expect to happen to the numbers in this chart if they buy better equipment?
You'd be able
Right.
to produce more.
Yes, the numbers would go up. Like, let's say I add 2 to each number in both of these columns. Why? Because I have better equipment. And graphically, then what would happen is that the curve would shift out and to the right. Okay, to the right means I'm able to produce more of both products. All right, so remember, we have espressos and lattes. Now, the basic shape of the curve won't change. That part hasn't changed. But guess what? Let me try that again. Look what happened. The curve shifts out. And that means I can have more of both goods without any change or increase in my resources. So in other words, the same number of employees can produce more espressos and more lattes. So a point that was previously unattainable, like this one, is suddenly now a point of maximum efficiency. So all of a sudden, I can have more espresso and more latte than I did before because of increased productivity. And like I said, that can be caused by many different factors. We can train the employees better. We can get more coffee beans, let's say. We can buy better machinery, that type of thing. And any of those would tend to increase our ability to produce lattes and espresso. So the entire curve would shift to the right. But of course, this takes time. In the short run, we're restricted to all the points on this curve. So this is more of a long-term activity. Increasing our output like this requires a change in resources. But this is how companies can evolve over time. If this happens across the board in all products that are being produced, that means in the population in general, our standards of living are increasing because we can have more of everything. Okay, and that's only going to help the consumer. So if you measure your standard of living by how many espressos and lattes you can have, certainly your standard of living is going up as a result of productivity. So productivity is a huge deal. We're going to see a lot more discussion about this later on because productivity is one of the major drivers of standards of living. But right now, it's enough to note that as productivity increases, we can produce more output, and therefore the entire curve shifts to the right. All right, now, I did mention last time that this graphical device, the Production Possibilities Frontier, is often used in the study of international trade to help us understand why countries trade with each other. Okay, it's a good graphical tool in the area of international trade. And let's see why. Because what we're going to basically do is think in terms of not a single company, but a country. All right. And also, by the way, don't forget, the slope of this curve can be thought of as the opportunity cost of producing more of one good compared with less of the other. All right. So we'll get more back into that when we look at our next example. All right. So, but before we do that, what we're going to do is have a brief history lesson about international trade theory. Okay, so we're going to introduce in particular the so-called law of comparative advantage. Now, this is a huge deal in economics, especially in international economics, because this is one of the key fundamental reasons behind the reasons why countries trade with each other. Now, it should be pretty clear, just intuitively, that not every country is equally efficient at producing goods and services. Okay, like for example, what kinds of products is the US especially good at making?
Technology.
Technology
Weapons.
products, like that iPhone in your pocket, that kind of thing. High tech products, this is where the US really shines. Computer chips, the chip that is in your computer is an American product. It may have come from Intel, for example. This is something that we're very good at, and we want to take advantage of that by selling our high-tech products to the rest of the world. Now, what kinds of things are we not so good at making?
Textiles,
Textiles, and what is the main reason for that?
our labor is more expensive.
Exactly. Okay, so in other words, within any country, if you think of the resources as belonging to the categories land, labor, and capital, as we've seen before, some countries have a lot of labor and some do not. Some countries have a lot of capital and some do not. Some countries have a lot of land. Perfect example of that. How much land does Hong Kong have? It's pretty small, and yet somehow they're one of the wealthiest countries in the world, or at least, well, now they're part of China, but still, it's one of the most affluent parts of China. Singapore is in the same boat. They have very, very little for such a large population. And of course, the classic example is Japan. How does Japan succeed when they have so little room? Because they're exceptionally good at technology. Okay, this is something they're really strong at. And of course, manufacturing. Their quality control is the best in the world. And so they can make cars much more efficiently than just about every other country in the world. So these are the things that they're very good at. So it stands to reason. Oh, one more thing. I almost forgot to mention this one. One area where the US is especially strong is in agriculture. Okay.
Maybe Michigan.
What was that?
Michigan.
Agriculture.
Oh, the
Farm.
West.
Farm.
It usually
Yes.
is the West Coast.
No. The Midwest, like Iowa, is like what I mean by that. Like, for example, corn is grown in Iowa, and wheat is grown in that area, and maybe Michigan too. But I think it's more the sort of the central Midwest, like Iowa and Indiana, and Illinois and Ohio. That whole area grows enormous quantities of crops, much of which is exported to the rest of the world because we can only eat so much food. We make so much food on our own that we have the ability to sell it to foreign countries. And from their perspective, even if they're buying it from us, it's still a lot cheaper than what they could do themselves. Like a country like Singapore, they have no land to spare for agricultural products. So what do? They buy it from another country like the United States. So every country typically is very good at certain things and not so good at other things. And so the logic behind all of this is that each country will specialize in the things that they're very strong at, and then they'll export their surplus to other countries and in turn buy the things that they're not so good at. And this way, everybody gains because output grows and our standards of living can go up. Okay, so the law of comparative advantage is based on the idea that each country should focus on what it does best and import the rest. Now, where did this come from, this idea? It evolved over many centuries. As I don't remember if we got to this point last time, but it's worth repeating that mercantilism was the prevailing wisdom for hundreds of years. And until finally Adam Smith came along and he published his very famous book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, in which he explained why mercantilism was a terrible idea. Now, he also explained a lot of other important concepts, which we still use in economics to this day, but that was one of his major contributions, this notion of absolute advantage. And then later, this idea was refined by another economist named David Ricardo, who was writing in the early 19th century when the Industrial Revolution in England was really getting going. Okay, in other words, by the time Ricardo comes along, England is the most powerful country in the world. They have the strongest armies, the strongest navies, and they're the leading manufacturing country in the world. So you can see where a lot of this is coming from. Mercantilists thought that trade was simply another form of warfare. It was just another way of taking advantage of your neighbors. It wasn't meant to be mutually beneficial. The idea was you exploit your fellow countries by selling them your merchandise and not buying anything in return. Right? That's what they're aiming for. They're saying, listen, we can take advantage of these guys if we sell them all of our wonderful manufactured products, and instead of buying their return, we'll insist on being paid in gold. And what are we going to do with that gold? Probably will increase the size of our armies and navies, and that will make it possible to acquire more colonies. Now remember, at this time, all these countries are in a mad rush to acquire as many colonies as they can. Why? To make themselves as wealthy as possible. So these are the years when, you know, the English are exploring in North America, and you know, the Spanish and the French and the Dutch are all over the place looking for spices and other products that are not available in the West. They considered themselves all to be in competition with each other, and it wasn't that unusual for them to also be at war with each other. It was a very let's just say this was a period in history when there was a lot of wars going on between these countries. As far as they were concerned, there was just another way of competing with each other. And of course, you're all aware, I guess, that this is also the height of piracy. Everybody knows about pirates. How could you not know? They're very popular in our culture. Everybody loves pirates, but mainly they confine themselves to the Caribbean islands and North America because the areas were there's very little population in those areas. So how did they make their money? How did pirates make their profits?
He stole them, right?
Yeah, but how did they do that? I mean, who did they steal it from? From other ships. They knew that especially Spanish treasure ships were coming out of Florida and heading back to Spain. So what did they do? They chased them down and they stole all the gold and silver after a lot of battling going back and forth. So yes, and in fact, a lot of these ships did crash, and some of them are still down there, by the way. And if you're interested in a very alternative career as a treasure hunter, it's still on the table. Yes, there's still quite a bit down there that nobody ever found. But anyway, so this is a very different period in history. Now, along, like I said, comes Adam Smith. He's considered to be part of what we call the Scottish Enlightenment. And he writes this very famous book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. For the most part, what he's trying to propose in this book is the idea that we should allow economies and people to attend to their own business without any real interference from the government. And we should also engage in free trade. The more people are allowed to make their own decisions, the more we'll all benefit from it. And that includes the area of trade, where he's basically saying that unlike the mercantilists who thought we could exploit each other, he's saying that trade will never happen unless both sides really believe that they're benefiting from it. So there's no point in trying to take advantage of anyone. If they think you're trying to take advantage of them, they won't trade with you. So therefore, trade can only take place when it is mutually beneficial. But how can it be mutually beneficial? It can be that way if each country focuses on what they produce best and buy the rest from the other countries. This is a direct quote from The Wealth of Nations, which should illustrate this very well. It's a little wordy, but you get the idea. If a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we can make it ourselves, we'd be better off buying it from them in some part of our own produce, in which we have some advantage. Okay, so in other words, the US will find itself trading computer chips for textiles because we have an advantage in high-tech products. We have a disadvantage in products that require a lot of labor because our labor is so expensive. And so this is what happens. If you were actually to check out all the clothes in your closet, you probably would not find a single item that was actually made in the United States. It's not likely because textiles do require a certain amount of manual labor, and that's why it's typically made in countries like India, because they have tons of labor and therefore wages are low. Now, David Ricardo came along and said, oh, by the way, when Smith was talking about absolute advantage, what he meant was a country that can produce a product with the fewest resources. All right, so now at this point in time, remember, technology isn't terribly well advanced. So when he says resources, he's mainly referring to labor. Okay, so in other words, if I can produce a product with 10 hours of labor and my other countries require 20 hours to produce that product, I should be the one who makes it and let them focus on something else. Then we have David Ricardo, who comes along and refines this notion. Before we do that, if we assume that Brazil is able to produce coffee more efficiently than Switzerland, and of course they are because their soil is so much better suited for it, as is the weather, but Switzerland is able to produce chocolate more efficiently than Brazil. What should they do? Well, the mercantilists would have said, listen, Brazil, why don't you export coffee to Switzerland and don't buy any of their chocolate? You would put heavy tariffs or taxes on the import of chocolate to prevent your own consumers from buying it. And before you know it, you've got a trade surplus, which means that gold is flowing from Switzerland into Brazil, which Brazil can now use to produce a bigger army or a bigger navy. And that in turn means more colonies. That's the way they looked at it. Now, as it turns out, ironically enough, especially in Spain, all this influx of gold and silver actually ended up leading just to a lot of inflation. It didn't really do them a whole lot of good to import all this gold and silver, because at that point in time, most countries were on the gold standard and they use gold and silver as money. So more gold and silver means a larger money supply, which means more inflation, as we will discuss later on in this course. So Adam Smith would have said, no, this is ridiculous. Brazil should just focus on the coffee, let Switzerland make the chocolate. Brazil will trade their surplus coffee to Switzerland in exchange for chocolate. And that way consumers in both countries can have more of both products and everybody is happy. That's how it should work, according to Adam Smith. Now, David Ricardo came along and said, this is good, but it doesn't really explain all the patterns of trade that we see in the real world. So he decided to take this a step further and create this concept called comparative advantage, which is essentially an extension of absolute advantage, which does a better job of explaining how and why countries trade with each other. So what is going on here that's different is that with comparative advantage, let's see. Well, all right, let me mention this right here. The main difference between the two, and it'll come up again later on. I just want to make it clear right up front. What is the difference between the two? Without absolute advantage means being able to produce a good with the fewest resources. So comparative advantage is slightly different. Comparative advantage means being able to produce a good at the lowest opportunity cost. Okay, that's the key distinction between the two. Now, why does this matter? Because according to these theories, if a country according to Adam Smith, if a country has an absolute advantage in all goods, then trade can't take place. What's the point? According to David Ricardo, even if this is true, a country's advantage will be smaller in some goods than in others. A country should focus on the goods with it in which it has the greatest advantage, and then import, oh boy, I'm out of space, the goods, oh, the hell is that? In which its advantage is the smallest. Okay. All right. I just clicked on something I shouldn't have. I just want to make sure everybody's still here. You know how that is. Your pinky can go anywhere it wants. Does anyone, you've noticed that about your pinkies, right? They have a mind of their own, especially when your hands get anywhere near a keyboard. Anytime you hit the wrong key, isn't it usually your pinky that's responsible? Yes, it is. Those clumsy little pinkies. All right. Anyway, so absolute advantage, again, means being able to produce a good with the fewest resources. Comparative advantage means being able to produce it with the lowest possible opportunity cost. Yeah, they're not very pleasant, are they? No, they're kind of cute, but we don't really need them very much, do we? No. Anyway, but on the other hand, it's a good thing we have them. I'll tell you why. If we didn't have pinkies, guess what? All of our numbers would be based on 8 instead of 10. So that would be awkward, don't you think? Imagine a world where everything is based on 8 instead of 10s. Wouldn't you find that a very confusing world?
Yeah.
There's something about 10 that just makes sense. Yeah, we love 10. And this is probably why the earliest humans created our numbering system based on 10, because they were counting on all 10 of these fingers. So there you go, something to think about when you complain about your pinkies. They helped us avoid having numbers based on 8. So, all right, anyway. So again, comparative advantage means being able to produce a good at the lowest opportunity cost. And then Adam Smith would have said that countries can only trade if they have a comparative, absolute disadvantage. Ricardo said, no, there's always room for trade, because no matter how good you are at producing products, your advantage is not the same in every product. Okay. It's like, you've probably met people who are very good at everything. Like Leonardo da Vinci, even. He was good at everything. But there's certain things in which he was incredibly good, and other things in which he was just extraordinary. Okay. And so, yeah, maybe he was the best painter ever, but maybe he wasn't the absolute top sculptor who ever lived. That honor might go to Michelangelo. So if, let's say, the Pope decided that he needs a painting and a sculpture for his palace, who's he going to pick for the painting, and who's he going to pick for the sculpture? Oh, are we confused? Da Vinci would do the painting and Michelangelo would do the sculpture. Doesn't that make the most sense?
Yeah.
Yes, you see, so we're going to choose each country according to what they're best at. Even if a country is good at everything, there's bound to be some products in which their advantage is not quite as noticeable. And so they can let other countries make those goods, even if they can do it themselves. Now, here's an analogy that I think will make sense to you as far as this is concerned. Imagine a lawyer who makes $500 an hour. He is also an exceptionally fast snow shoveler. For some reason, let's say He's a big athletic guy and he shovels snow fast. Now, one day it snows and he would need to spend 2 hours shoveling his driveway. Next door is a college student who would need 3 hours to shovel that sidewalk or that driveway. But only charges $10 an hour. So what should the lawyer do?
Maybe call the college kid to shovel it for him.
Okay, now that's okay. Now the college student is slower at shoveling snow. So why does he want to hire that college student?
Because he's making $500 off.
There you
Sorry.
go. In order to do it himself, he's going to lose $1,000 worth of legal work just to save $20, or in this case, $30. That doesn't make any sense. So even though the lawyer is better at both the law and shoveling, he's going to do the law himself and let the college student do the shoveling. And in that way, his revenues will go up. Instead of making let's say he works 8 hours a day, the snow shoveling would reduce that to 6. That would be $3,000 a day. If he works all 8 hours and then pays the student to do this work, he'll get $1,000 minus the 30. So it's $800 versus $970. So in this case, the lawyer has an absolute advantage in both activities, but he's going to let the student do the shoveling because that's where his advantage is less pronounced. And the same thing is going to happen with countries. The United States, for example, in principle, could grow all of its own coffee. There's just one problem with that. There isn't a whole lot of land in the US that's well suited for coffee. Hawaii basically is it. Maybe parts of Florida, I don't know. Possibly parts of California. Why would we not ever want to do that though? Why do we just buy it all from foreign countries?
Because it's cheaper.
It's cheaper. In Brazil, they have tons of land that's excellently suited for coffee. So why don't we do this? Use that land to build factories and build machinery and high-tech equipment and let the Brazilians sell us their coffee. That's exactly what trade is all about. Okay, we just want to spend all of our time doing something we're good at. We'll let the others do the things we're not so good at. It's the same thing for an individual. Like when you graduate from college, are you going to spend your whole weekend growing your own food in your garden?
No,
Why not?
because I have a college degree. I'm supposed to use it right.
That's right. You have other things you could be doing. And the food, let's face it, is not all that terribly expensive. So growing your own food, sure, you'd save a little money, but you'd be sacrificing a lot more, wouldn't you? Even if it's just having fun. So the idea here is you want to allocate your resources as efficiently as possible. And so in terms of trade, this is exactly what we're trying to accomplish. So I just want to mention this here. The lawyer should hire the college student, hire the student, okay? And so I think it's pretty clear why that would have to be the case. So that's why the US doesn't make its own clothes. Why? The time that we could spend making clothes could also be spent making other more advanced products that we could then sell for a profit to other countries. As far as this is concerned, suppose that Brazil and Switzerland, and this is just hypothetical, if Brazil is better at both products, let's just make that assumption, but their advantage is more pronounced in the coffee than the chocolate, that means Brazil has a comparative advantage in the coffee. It has an absolute advantage in both, but it only has a comparative advantage in the coffee. Just like the lawyer has a comparative advantage in legal services, but the student is said to have a comparative advantage in the shoveling. And so that's how the trade takes place. So let's see, I think I've got a numerical example here. No, okay. So here's where we're going to start. Or actually, this is a full-blown example, and it's going to take a while to get through the whole thing. This is based on Ricardo's book, and I think I mentioned before that this is now the early 1800s. The book came out in 1817, when England is the world's leading manufacturing country, and Portugal is an agricultural country for the most part. They have some industry, but it's not nearly as advanced as England's. On the other hand, their soil is perfectly suited for growing many different agricultural products, particularly olives, oranges, lemons, and wine grapes. Okay, so you know where this is going. We're going to see that it would make sense for Portugal to forget all about making manufactured goods and just focus on what they're good at, which is agricultural goods. In England, it's the other way around. Now, you know, England is not a particularly large country, considering how many people live there. They don't have a ton of farmland. Not really. I mean, not like Portugal. And then on top of that, what is the weather like in England compared to Portugal?
It's cold.
It's cold and it rains a lot. It's kind of dreary a lot of the time compared to sunny Portugal, which is right on the Mediterranean. They're right there. And so that means it stands to reason that English farming will not be as efficient as, or at least for certain crops, I should say, it's Portuguese. So for products that require warm weather, like wine, grapes, olives, oranges, lemons, those are not going to grow in England, but they'll grow just fine in Portugal. Yeah, English weather, there are certain things they're very good at. Their weather, like they raise a lot of sheep in England. Their lamb is one of their big products. But, like wine, I mean, they can grow wine, but it's going to be a struggle compared to Portugal. So let's assume the following. Here's a table which shows us how much labor. Now, remember, at this point in time, mostly labor is the primary input into the production process. It's not yet gotten to the point where everything is completely automated. Like now, I mean, if you go to visit a farm, I mean, a lot of the work is actually being done by machines. Whereas 100 years ago, it was all being done by manual labor. And that's why one of the reasons why our agriculture is so efficient. Machinery. And in fact, that's another reason why farms are just so big. Why? Why couldn't a small farmer compete in this day and age with the larger farms? Let's say I wanted to set up a little farm, or let's say you do. Let's say you graduate from college and you say, you know what, I've always wanted to be a corn farmer, and you buy a couple of acres in Iowa and you start growing corn. What's likely to happen?
Well, if you want to sell that corn, the companies that can sell it for a much lower price, people will end up buying that.
But can you produce at the same cost levels as the gigantic neighbors?
No.
There's
No.
economies of
No,
scale.
because you'd probably have to invest millions of dollars in equipment. And no matter what happens, you just don't have that much land. And so your cost of production will be much higher than the farmers with enormous plots of land who have all this equipment to use. And so you're not going to be able to compete with them. Whereas 100 years ago, pretty much everyone was on an equal footing because most of the work was done by hand. And so as long as you were strong, you could be a farmer. Now it requires a ton of capital equipment. And so only the big ones can really survive. But the benefit of that is that the food that we buy is pretty cheap when you stop and think about it. I mean, when you go into the supermarket and say, wow, look at all those wonderful oranges over there for like a quarter each or whatever it is, where did they probably come from? Not
Very large farm,
Yes, but what state? Mostly
Florida.
Florida or California. How in the world did they manage to grow all these wonderful oranges and ship them up here to New York? And this still costs so little because those farms are enormous and they're incredibly efficient because they have so much capital equipment to grow the crops. Okay. So anyway, so here it's England and Portugal. Now, in England, it only takes 1 hour to make a yard of cloth. Whoever's working in the factory probably has access to a lot of machinery, a lot of advanced machinery by the standards of the time. In Portugal, they're probably doing 100% of it by hand. Not that they're not good workers, but they don't have access to the same kind of machinery. Just like you as the little farmer, compared to your gigantic neighbors, you're not lazy, but you're at a huge disadvantage compared to your neighbors. On the other hand, the wine, now here, by the way, this is a very artificial example. We're doing this for a reason. You'll see in a minute. We're going to assume that England is slightly more efficient in wine producing than Portugal. Now, in reality, that's not the way it works. But just for this example, let's assume that the English are very much more efficient at producing cloth and only slightly more efficient at wine. So Adam Smith would have said, you know what? There's no way that England and Portugal can trade with each other. It just doesn't make any sense, because England has the absolute advantage in the production of both. But David Ricardo would have said, no, that's not the way it works. This is just like the lawyer and the college student. England is the lawyer, okay, I guess. Portugal is the college student. England's advantage in cloth is so substantial that it doesn't make any sense for them to grow any wine at all, even if they're slightly more efficient. If they just make all the cloth and let Portugal make all the wine, the total output of both goods will go up and consumers in both countries will be better off, because England has a comparative advantage in cloth, but as we'll see, Portugal has the comparative advantage in wine. And that's why they should specialize in those products. All right. So England's absolute advantage is in both, but they only have a comparative advantage in the cloth. Now, how can we prove this? We're going to prove it by calculating the opportunity costs each nation faces in the production of both products. Now, how do we decide this? All right. So when you look at this carefully, if England wants to make a gallon of wine, how much cloth do they have to give up? Well, we have to think about it in terms of labor. So making a gallon of wine sucks up 3 hours of labor, which could have been used to make 3 hours of cloth. So that's pretty painful. So they're saying that in England, each 1 gallon of wine they're making prevents them from making 3 hours of cloth. So therefore, the opportunity cost of each gallon of wine must be 3 yards of cloth. All right. Aha. Now, Portugal, if they want to make wine, the 4 hours that they need to make the wine could have been used to make slightly less than a yard of cloth, specifically 4/5 of an hour of cloth. So it's not a big sacrifice to make wine in Portugal, is it? Because you're only losing 4/5 of a yard of cloth every time you make wine. So therefore, I would say that Portugal's opportunity cost in terms of the wine is only 4/5 of a yard of cloth, which is much lower than in England. And that's how we know that England has the comparative advantage in, how Portugal has the comparative advantage in the wine, because they have a much lower opportunity cost. Beautiful. Now let's do it with the cloth. Now this is easier. I'll tell you why. Here's a little shortcut. Each country's opportunity cost in cloth will simply be the inverse of their opportunity cost of wine. Okay, so in other words, before we even do the calculations, you can see that England's opportunity cost of cloth will be 1/3 of a gallon of wine, and Portugal's will be 5/4 of a gallon of wine. All right, let's look at those. There we go. So who now has a comparative advantage? England, okay? So you can see, in spite of the fact that England is better at both goods, somehow they do not have the comparative advantage in both goods. Their comparative advantage is in cloth, not in wine. And so David Ricardo would say, no problem, you can trade as long as England just makes the cloth and Portugal just makes the wine. All right, now, and this will increase output in both countries, And that means consumers will benefit in both countries. There will not be any trade, as Smith said, if they are trying to take advantage of each other. If they don't both benefit, then no trade will take place at all. All right, now we can prove that by making some assumptions. Let's start out by saying that England has 1,200 hours of labor available to it, and they choose to produce 900 yards of cloth and 100 gallons of wine. Now, if you look at their, and by the way, we're going to use this to create a production possibilities frontier. And so here's the way it works. Now, they have 1,200 hours of labor. We recall that each gallon of wine takes 3 hours of labor, which means they can potentially produce 400 gallons of wine. Or since the cloth only takes 1 hour, they could make 1,200 yards of cloth or anything in between. Now, by the way, this is a straight line, and that means the opportunity costs are fixed across this line. In fact, why don't we go back for a second? You see how the opportunity cost of cloth is a third of a gallon of wine. That's the slope of this curve. All right, the opportunity cost of the cloth is the slope of this curve, which is 1/3. Actually, it's negative 1/3, but we can ignore the sign. So they choose, because of domestic demand, to make 100 gallons of wine and 900 yards of cloth. So clearly, this is a country where they'd rather have lots of clothes on than drink a lot of wine. By the way, that decision comes down to the consumers. The production part is different. We want to make sure we're on this line somewhere in order to be as efficient as possible. But where do we go on the line itself? That depends on the consumers. Now here comes Portugal, and they also have 1,200 yards of cloth. But guess what? Their costs are very different. They can make up to 300 gallons of wine with that 1,200 hours of labor or 240 yards of cloth. So if you recall, England could do 400 or 1,200. If you put these together on the same axes, let's see, it's going to look something like this. And so it's clear, I hope, from this diagram, look how much more cloth England can make than Portugal, but only slightly more wine. So that means that's a hint that maybe England should focus on the cloth. So Portugal domestically produces and consumes 75 wines and 180 cloths. And by the way, I want to make one other point here. Without trade, a country, and this is a huge deal, can only produce or can only consume what it produces. If we want more wine, we can't have any, because let's say you're in Portugal and you're like, well, there's not enough wine. Well, we can't get any more until we grow some next year. So there has to be an exact balance between what you're consuming and what you're producing, which is clearly not the case in the real world today, where a lot of the things we own are not built in the United States. Now, what happens if the countries decide to get together and they do exactly what Ricardo recommends, which means Portugal goes over here and focuses all of their attention on the wine. England comes down here and they focus all of their attention on the cloth. Okay, so what happens now? Before, England and Portugal were making 1,080 yards of cloth. How do you know? Because if you combine the two, remember, England chose to make 900 yards of cloth and 100 gallons of wine. In fact, we could put this again on the same graph. let's say right about here. $100 wine, 180, 900 cloths. And you can tell just by looking at them right now, the total between the two, which is kind of important. Let me get this out of here. Right now, as things stand, total output between the two countries in cloth is 900 plus 180, 1,080. Total output of wine is therefore 100 plus 75. Now, clearly, something's going to improve because look at this. England, if they specialize in cloth, they can make 1,200 yards. Oh, look at that. So the world output of cloth, well, all right, well, the total between the two of them will go up by 120 yards. What about the wine? If Portugal focuses on the wine, there will be 300 gallons of wine in the world instead of only 175. So you can see already the specialization that the two countries will undertake will increase the cloth by 120, and the wine increases by 125. So everybody's happy now. All they have to do is work out a deal in which they trade their surplus for each other in such a way that both countries end up with more of both, more wine and more cloth. And certainly we can do that because the output is so much larger now. So let's see how that works. All right. See, I've got a summary table here somewhere. There we go. Just as we saw, the total cloth output goes up by 120 yards, and the total wine output goes up by 125 gallons. Now, let's assume that after specialization takes place, they agree to trade 200 yards of cloth for 200 gallons of wine. It's very simple. England has more cloth than they need, so they agree to trade 200 yards of cloth. Right now, they have no wine at all, and they want wine, so they're going to import 200 gallons of wine from Portugal. Now, the question is, where does that put them compared to where they started out? All right, so in the absence of trade, this is how much the two countries produced and consumed. Okay, that's fine. We saw that already. We added them up. We know what's going to happen next. We're going to see how much output goes up with specialization, it's called. Okay, so now England is producing 1,200 yards of cloth, Portugal 300 wine, and you can see that's more than we have now. But now trade takes place. The English will trade 200 of these cloths to Portugal in exchange for 200 wines. So all of a sudden, England has 1,000 yards of cloth and 100 yards of wine. Without trade before, remember, it was 900 and 100. And in Portugal, they have 200 yards of cloth with 100 yards of wine. What did they have before? Let's see, I forgot already. 180 and 75. So what just happened? So those numbers in parentheses are what they started out with. So who gained and by how much? Are they both better off now? Of course they are. Both countries have more of both goods, and yet no more resources were used than before. What changed? The only thing that changed is the specialization. There's no more labor being used. There's no more machinery. There's nothing except that we are trading. the goods that we're very good at. So there's a gain here of, let's say, 100 for England in the cloth. They gained 100 gallons of wine. The Portuguese gained 20 yards of cloth, and they gained 25 gallons of wine. Now, if you notice, the two countries did not split the gains equally. It doesn't have to work that way. And in fact, if you recall, at this point in time, England is by far the strongest military in the world. So Portugal is not really in a position to argue. But on the other hand, if they really feel taken advantage of, then they're not going to trade at all. So what we're going to do now is show how the new production possibilities frontiers look after trade. So England suddenly moved out to here. Now look, we moved to the right. Remember before we saw that when this curve shifts to the right, more output of both is available. More output of more of both goods are available. And guess what? We did not improve our technology. We did not increase the amount of resources we have. This is 100% due to specialization and trade. Nothing else changed. We're still using the same amount of labor. We still have the same resources. Where did this come from? Specialization and trade. Okay, so this used to be unattainable. Not anymore. And the same thing is happening in Portugal. What do you know? So we moved out to the right, and this is due to specialization. We don't have any more labor. We don't have any more land to grow the wine on due to specialization and trade. And it's the only thing that's different. How do you like that? So trade is shifting our production possibilities frontiers to the right, and it's all due to the specialization. And this is why in the real world, everybody does a job in which they're very good at, and they pay people to do everything else. Like the lawyer, he's not going to shovel his own snow. It would be ludicrous. He's probably not going to grow his own food. He's not going to make his own clothes. He may not do anything for himself. He may pay people to fix his house. Why? Because he's a great lawyer. He's not good at those other things. And so he's going to make himself better off by just doing one thing and one thing only, and that is practice the law. All right. On the other hand, there might be people in the neighborhood who are exceptionally good at fixing things, and they're going to be the ones who he pays to fix his house. But they don't have a law degree, so that's where their specialty is. All right, so I've summarized these into a nice little table too, so you can see them. So England gained 100 of each, and Portugal gained 20 and 25. Now again, both countries benefited. Not equally, but they both benefited. And that's all that matters. They were willing to trade with each other. That's the bottom line. So with no increase in resources, output of both goes up, as does consumption in both countries. The gains from trade are not necessarily evenly distributed, but England gained more, but both of them gained. Well, that was interesting. Does that make sense to everyone? Do you think you get this concept of comparative advantage?
Yeah.
Excellent. Beautiful. All right. So if I gave you another set of numbers, could you figure out how this works? Good. Because I do have a problem set. We'll get to it, not now, but I have a problem set that you can work on and make sure that you truly understand what we've just done. We'll probably have to save it for next week sometime, but for now, what I would like to do is switch to something completely different. That something is found in chapter 4 of our book, and it is, what do you see? Supply and demand. Now, if you've already had a micro course, you've already seen a lot of this before, and that's fine. It's just a review, but we have to analyze supply and demand in both micro and macro, because everything we do in economics is somehow related to supply and demand. Okay, so this could not possibly be more important. All right, so we're going to be focusing, and when we look at demand, we'll be focusing on consumers, and when we look at supply, we'll be focusing on producers. All right, so we're going to start with demand. This is the one we all should understand the best because it relates directly to individual consumers. So, of course, as a consumer, there's a lot of products in the marketplace that you could potentially buy. How do you decide what to buy and what not to buy?
What to buy and what not to buy. Guess what you need.
Okay, what you need is a good way of putting it. Or sometimes you buy things just because you want them. Is that not the case? Is everything you buy absolutely necessary for your survival?
Nah.
No. So yes, of course. Let's say, imagine yourself 10 years from now, you've graduated, you have your own house, and you have to buy food and you have to pay for the utilities and all the rest, property taxes, you name it. But then maybe there's a little money you can set aside and use it to have fun with it. But now here's the bottom line. How do you know how much you're willing to pay for a specific product? Like you go to Starbucks and they're asking $2 for a coffee. Why do you choose to buy it? They're not making you buy it, are they? They didn't make you come in the store. Why did you walk in that door and pay $2 for that coffee?
I guess you have to feel like you're getting more for your money than if you kept the money in your pocket.
Exactly. It must be your opinion that the coffee is worth at least $2 to you. $2 worth of satisfaction. Economists call it utility. If you thought that the coffee, let's say you don't really particularly like coffee, then you might not be willing to pay $2 for it. So the fact that you plunk down $2, which by the way is $2 you could have spent on something else, means you must value it at least $2, if not more. And so each individual, oh, and by the way, how would you react if you went back the next time and the price went up to $3? Ooh, would that cause you to start thinking about
Go to Dunkin'.
what might you do? Oh, go to Dunkin'. You might. That's exactly right. You might go down the street to Dunkin' Donuts, or maybe you'd switch to tea or something cheaper. So in other words, it's understood, or at least we're assuming in economics, that everybody has a good sense of how much they value every product in the marketplace and how much they're willing to pay for it. And that's all based on 100% subjective judgment. How much is that product worth compared to the value of this money that I'm giving them? Especially since, like I said, you could use that money for something else. So with demand, we're assuming that everybody understands how much they're willing to pay for a product. The one thing we can assume, though, that everybody has in common is that the more expensive something is, the less you'll buy of it. Does that make sense to everybody intuitively? Yes. Like if you go into the Starbucks and the price went up to $3, are you going to buy more because of that? No, of course not. Partially because your income, in effect, your income has been reduced when you have to pay more money for a product, but also you're thinking, no, this is ridiculous, $3. And even then, even if it is, you're like, oh, okay, I'll pay the $3. What if it goes up to $20? What would you do then? I think you would stop drinking coffee. Well, maybe not everybody, but yes. There are people who would still pay the 20, but let's just say not very many of them. And Starbucks knows that. In fact, how do they decide how much to charge? Did they just pick $2 out of the sky? What must they have done to choose that price?
Does it depend on how much it costs to make it?
That's part of it. Absolutely. They can't sell it for less than it costs to make it. But let's say that it only costs $1 to make that cup. Why did they choose $2 and not $2.50 or $3? I mean, wouldn't it make sense to charge $3? Wouldn't they make more money in every cup?
When the total amount of money they made goes down.
It could very well. So imagine this scenario. If I raise the price from $2 to $3, that's an increase of 50%. What if that causes me to lose 3/4 of my sales? Uh-oh, I've screwed up royally now because I've pushed away so many customers that my revenues will actually go down. So they have done a lot of research. They've observed how people behave. They've chosen a price at which they believe their profits will be maximized. That's why they chose that number. It wasn't an accident. Now, by the way, this discussion will actually somewhat have to wait till another day because here we're just focusing on demand itself, but it's a very interesting topic to talk about. In fact, next time you go to the supermarket, you're going to look around and say, why are these prices what they are? Oh, I see. This is what they're charging to maximize their profits. There's no other reason for choosing those prices. Oh, I see we have a guest today. Somebody's kitty is interested in supply and demand, and I'm all for that. So, the thing is about cats is they either don't care or they don't understand when you're online. I guess they're like, well, you're there, therefore I feel free to jump on you, don't I? So yes, we do see this from time to time. Hello, kitty. Are you enjoying this lecture? Oh, I bet you are. All right, well, anyway, so demand is showing us the relationship. And by the way, before we go any further, we're going to make a distinction here. We can define demand for an individual consumer and for the entire market. So here we're thinking about an individual who knows what they want to spend on a product. So we're assuming that you know actually how much you're willing to pay for every quantity or every unit of a good. So we're looking at the relationship between what we're going to call the quantity demanded and the price, and we're going to hold everything else constant. That's an important detail. We'll relax that later on, but right now we're assuming that everything else stays the same. We only want to looking at focusing on the relationship between the price and the quantity. Okay. Now, what factors determine the demand for a product? So we're going to break these down into some 6 very broad categories. And I think you'll find these categories to be quite interesting. So the first one, of course, has to be tastes and preferences. Like, for example, with the Starbucks, if you don't like coffee, you're not likely to buy it, are you? Absolutely not. Now, you know that your tastes can change over time. For example, how is your taste for, let's say, food in general different than it was when you were a little kid? What's one of the big changes that happens? I was thinking about sugar and sweetness. When you're a little kid, you want everything to be sweet. How about now? Do you like things to be sweet? Yes, that's
yeah.
right. Sometimes, but not like when you were a kid. Okay, so your tastes will change over time. So your demand, for example, for Lucky Charms is probably lower than it was when you were 8. Would you agree? Would you say that's a fair statement?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so your tastes do change over time. Or how about this one? For the market as a whole, would you think that people buy more organic foods than they did 20 years ago?
Yes.
Yes, they do. Okay, it's gotten to be all the rage to have organic foods. So the demand for organic foods has changed over time. Over the last 20 years, let's say, it has steadily increased. On the other hand, what about tobacco?
Dropped.
It has certainly dropped, yes. Compared to 20 or 30 years ago, people certainly smoke less than they used to, partially because, I mean, it's hard to believe it now, but in the past, people were allowed to smoke just about everywhere, except possibly on airplanes. I mean, imagine yourself getting on a train and everyone's smoking, or going to your office building and people are smoking. It was allowed. Yes, it was. Now it's getting to the point where in Manhattan, they have a special squad of snipers who will take out anyone smoking. Well, maybe not just yet, maybe next year. They're working on it. The cigarette squad, they're going to try to shoot that thing out of your finger if they can, but if not, oh well. No. But yes, it's becoming more and more restricted to smoking, and it's also more and more socially unacceptable. I think you'll agree. I mean, do you know anyone who smokes? I hope you guys don't smoke. But if you do, you probably notice that it's more and more difficult to get away with it. In other words, not only is it restricted, but I don't know. I think you'll notice that people are a little bit more, let's say they look down at you a little bit more than they used to. Anyway, now, of course, they've got this vaping thing. What exactly is vaping? Is it like a substitute for cigarettes? Does anyone here actually know what it is? No, but it's meant to be a substitute of some kind. I was under the impression it was designed to help you quit, but I don't know. I've heard things that it's even more addictive than real cigarettes. Vaporized air. Oh, is that what it means?
No, but it's not vaporized air, it's chemicals.
Oh,
It's chemicals and they put nicotine in it actually.
oh.
And it's very bad. It's pretty much almost as bad for you as cigarettes.
That's
what I
not
heard.
true. That's not true.
It is. There's a lot of
That's not
dangerous
true.
chemicals that actually.
Hmm.
There's literally lead in it.
Yeah, I think the effects just aren't known. Like people argue very different things, but it seems like they don't know if it's just as bad or even if it could be worse because we just haven't had it long enough.
It's known that it's at least equally bad.
Sure. Then people are dying all the time from cancer from Juuls.
Well,
my
vape
man.
hasn't existed long enough to test the long-term effects.
The effects from cigarettes can be seen within a year, even like a month, dude. You can see the effects. So it's like,
Yeah. This is something that I know nothing about. And so I'm glad you all have an opinion about this because I don't know anything about it. But I can see the logic of saying that they haven't been around long enough to be sure what's going on with them. But yet, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know enough about it. But what I do know, though, is that the demand for cigarettes has fallen off quite a bit since the last, even to just 10, 15 years. And it's partially because of taxes. Anyone here, if you know anyone who smokes, the taxes on cigarettes are very high. And in fact, you know how you can tell? Has anyone here ever been to a duty-free shop at an airport? What are they doing in those shops?
Selling without taxes.
That's right. The import tariffs that would normally be attached to those goods, for whatever reason, you can get away without paying them. And so what kind of products do they tend to carry in those duty-free shops?
Luxury goods.
Yeah, a lot of it is cigarettes, liquors in particular, perfumes, and others, items that have a lot of import tariffs. So you know that the government is taxing them very heavily if they're being sold in duty-free shops. So, but anyway, so yes, cigarettes are heavily taxed, but still the demand for tobacco has fallen dramatically. And so that's a matter of tastes and preferences. Consumer income. Now, this is as obvious as it gets, although maybe not as much as you think. What tends to happen when your income goes up?
Price goes up.
Not necessarily, but you buy more of everything, don't you? Like, imagine yourself, like compare yourself now with, let's say in 10 years when you've been working for a while and your income is pretty good. What are your consumption patterns going to look like then compared to now?
You
Well,
buy more expensive items.
That's right. Will you have a new car? Maybe. Will you have a new computer? Maybe. Will you have a lot more clothes? Yes, I bet you will. Why? You're the same person. Your tastes are the same. What's changed?
You can afford them.
Yes, you can. And that's an important detail. And of course, as the economy grows, as people become more affluent, the demand for products tends to grow for that very reason, just because we can afford to pay for them. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. Anyway, let's jump ahead and look at that one a little more closely, though, because in economics, we're actually going to make an important distinction here between two types of goods, and they're called normal goods and inferior goods. By the way, what does the word inferior actually mean?
Less than?
Something that's not as good as something else. Like, let's say, if you go to the store to buy beef, you notice how they have different ratings on them for the amount of fat they have. Like, I think in the US, you're only allowed to sell beef as low as 80% lean and 20% fat. It goes as high as, I think it's like 93% lean and 7% fat. So between 93% lean and 80% lean, which is the inferior product?
80% lean.
80%, that's right, because there's a lot of fat in there. So inferior means not as good quality as another good. So we're going to assume that there are just two types of goods. And the way we can tell them apart is the following. A normal good is just one for which people buy more when their incomes go up, which is really most goods in the economy. But then what about these inferior goods? What does that mean? These are goods where we buy less when our incomes go up. Now, what kind of products could these possibly be? These are goods that people only buy when they can't afford something better. So to me, a good example of this is if you drive a car, you pull up into a gas station, do they just have one type of gas there? No, what do they have?
3.
They usually have 3 grades, and they're usually listed as, and this tells me absolutely nothing, but 87. Oh my God, how did that get to be pink? Hold on. 87, 89, and let's say 91. Some of them have a 93 as well. Which one is the cheapest?
The lowest octane.
That's right. The one here, this is the lowest. And then now sometimes the prices aren't that far apart from each other, but sometimes the difference can be really a lot. So what's going on here? Now, this is, again, something I know very little about, but I do know that this is supposedly better for your engine, but it's a lot of money. So if you're a poor, struggling college student, which of these are you likely to buy?
The 87.
That's right. But once you graduate and you have a real job, which one are you more likely to buy?
Like 89 or 91.
That's right. So if that happens for people, if they buy less 87 when they have more money, then we can make the case that 87 grade gas is an inferior good. You're only buying it because it's cheap. When you get more money in your hands, you're going to buy less of it. And if that's the case, we classify that as an inferior good. Okay, so what else? Well, we already have the gas. Generic drugs, like, for example, Tylenol versus, let's say, CVS painkiller. Now, if you look at the labels very carefully, especially when it comes to drugs, most likely they're the same thing. The only difference is that this is a red box with a big brand name on it. This is not. So you go to the shelf and this one is $8 and this is $12, let's say. As a poor, struggling college student with a headache, which one do you buy?
The painkiller.
That's right. But when you graduate and you got all this money floating around, which one are you more likely to buy?
Painkiller.
Really? Okay, well then you're very frugal and congratulations. But most people would do what, do you think?
The Tylenol.
That's right. Why? Because it's a brand name and the perception is that it's a better product, even if in reality it's chemically identical to the CVS painkiller. And then the companies know this and they spend a lot of time playing this up. The ironic thing is that there's a very real chance that the company that makes the Tylenol, and this is something you're not supposed to know about, that they're actually making both of them. And we're going to have this conversation again in a later chapter, but why in the world would they make both products? Aren't they competing with themselves? Does that make sense? They're making them both. Why?
Cause they want a bigger market share.
A bigger market share. The college students who can't afford the Tylenol will buy the painkiller, the CVS painkiller. If that wasn't available to them, they probably would go without it and have a headache. So by having another alternative that appeals to people with lower incomes, the Johnson & Johnson company can get revenues from both markets. It's not only not costing them money, it's actually helping them earn more money. So anytime you go to any store that has generic brands, almost certainly it was made by one of the big name companies. In fact, the other day I was looking at an article where, have you ever heard of that company, Costco?
Mm-hmm.
What is Costco all about?
They have like stocks of like just in bulk supplies, whatever you'd
Right.
like.
Yes. In other words, you go in there and they have lots of great products, but guess what? You have to buy big quantities to go in there. In other words, you can't just buy like a single can of tuna fish. You probably have to buy 10 of them. But then in exchange for that, you get to save a lot of money. Costco has its own brand, generic brand, which is called Kirkland. And it turns out that on some of their Kirkland coffees, and I didn't know this because I don't belong to Costco, on the label, it actually says, it tells consumers that this is being made by Starbucks. It actually says it on the label. Now that surprises me. I don't know why they would give up that information, but because it's true. I think they want you to think, I know it says Kirkland, but since Starbucks made it, that's okay. I'll buy it anyway. And so the big companies are making these other generic brands because it gives them more revenues. And so as a consumer though, again, once you graduate, and not everybody, but many people are likely to gravitate towards the Tylenol because they feel like they can afford it now. If that's the case, we define CVS painkiller as an inferior good. And then of course use textbooks. Now this is a bit of a dated reference because, this is going back to ancient times when all books were physical books, and the only options you had were new and used. That's it. That's all we had. No rentals, no online books, physical textbooks. Either it's brand new or somebody else has used it. What was the motivation to buy a used textbook?
Cheaper.
It could be a lot cheaper, and you know how expensive textbooks are. You do, don't you? Oh my God, are they expensive? That's partially because you're a captive audience, by the way. But we'll have that conversation another day. So why would you buy an old used textbook when somebody's already written in it and maybe they spilled coffee on the cover and all this and that? What's the point?
Cheaper.
It's cheaper. So let's say all of a sudden you find a summer job and you've got lots of money. When you come back in September, are you going to buy used books?
Maybe not.
Maybe not. You may still, maybe you do, but a lot of people won't because as far as they're concerned, they only bought these textbooks because it was cheap. Now they got some real money and they can afford good textbooks. So this one also could be thought of as an inferior product. Well, that was interesting. So basically what the bottom line is, not every product sells better when people have more money. In fact, some of them sell worse. Now, and by the way, here's an interesting side note. This is one of the reasons why Walmart is so successful. What do they do? What is their secret? Why are they so successful? What is true about Walmart, which is not true about Costco? Costco, you have to be a member to go in there, and you have to buy enormous quantities of everything. With Walmart, anyone can walk in the door. They have everything, and everything is cheap. How do they do it? Because they have enormous buying power. Okay, they can buy tons of products at very low prices and pass this along to you. But when the economy slows down, where do people shop? Walmart. Okay, so even though people perceive it as being sort of a low-end kind of store, it has its place, doesn't it? And so they sell tons of merchandise and they make a lot of money. lots and lots of money. Okay. In fact, the founder, Sam Walton rather, for while he was alive, he was one of the richest men in the world. And there's a reason for that. Now, the ironic thing is about Sam is that he was very cheap, though. He kept the same house and the same truck and the same everything, even when he became a multi-billionaire. I don't think I would go that far. If I had $1 billion, I think I would at least buy a nice car. You know, I mean, come on. All right. Anyway, so we've got 4 more factors here to look at before we can derive our demand curve. And but we have to understand these factors, otherwise the demand curve will make no sense whatsoever. So here's what we're going to do. Today's Thursday. Obviously, we have a big weekend coming up. What I would like you to do is make sure you truly understand our comparative advantage example, and then start reading through the chapter 4 discussion so you can see where we're going next week. All right, because there's a long way to go here, but it's a very important chapter. In fact, maybe the most important chapter in the book. All right, so I think it's time to stop. We've had plenty of fun for one day, so why don't we call it quits? And unless there's last minute questions, I'll see you all next Monday.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good weekend.
Thanks.
Professor.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.
All right.